Let me go ahead and introduce our two speakers for today. First is Kevin Trim, Vice President of Product Management at Certara. Kevin brings over 17 years of experience in pharmaceutical research and software development. He spearheads product strategy for Certara's data science platforms and leads implementation of technology solutions, collaborating closely with clients. Our other presenter for today is Daniel Matlis, founder and president of Excendia Incorporated. Daniel has 3 decades of industry experience spanning the life science value network. He is an active contributor to FDA's Case for Quality Initiative since 2014, is a member of FDA's Advisory Council on Modeling, Simulation, and in silico clinical trial, and has co-chaired the Product Quality Outcomes Analytics Initiative with agency officials. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand the presentation off to Daniel to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Danny, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. What we'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about FDA's digital transformation initiatives and how they're going to impact the industry. So let's move to our next slide. Just our safe harbor statement. The content from today's session represents Excendia's analysis that is sourced from our primary quantitative and qualitative research, as well as our interactions with FDA officials, industry executives, and first-hand experiences from our clients. So let's talk about FDA's digital transformation roadmap. So we wrote an insight brief going into a lot of detail. What we'll do today is cover some of the highlights from that report. And just to bring it at a very high level, Vid Desai, who is now the FDA's CIO and first director of the Office of Digital Transformation, said that this new technology environment that we're all living in has to assume that we're all very distributed, but we need to be collaborative, and it needs to be secure and integrated. The new environment also, according to Desai, has to be agile and enable us to move to the cloud. And also, it builds on all the work that the agency has been doing over the years. So let's talk about a little bit of history and how we got to where we are. So FDA's Digital Transformation Initiative actually started back in 1997 with 21 CFR 11 when it became effective. But from its internal standpoint, in 2009, we had the opportunity to interview a number of FDA officials and published a report on the future of FDA. We called it the future of FDA operating in an electronic world. And what we learned there is very insightful. So back in 2009, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Armando Oliva, who was the director of Bioinformatics at FDA at the time. And he said back in 2009, that it's fair to say that the FDA is actively moving towards an electronic world where all regulated product information comes in electronically. He couldn't tell us exactly when, but he was actually very well targeted on what we're achieving today. You know, at the time there were active discussions at the agency to move to an all electronic submissions environment. We're getting there. And we are there for the biopharma side, where all regulated product information, whether it's product quality, manufacturing, pre-market, and post-market data, is managed in an electronic format. So how did FDA do that? If we look at the Bioinformatics board that the agency had put together back in 2009, many of the initiatives that we are actually taking advantage of today started with this Bioinformatics board. So things like the Regulatory Product Submission Initiative was part of the task that the BIB did. what they called information computer technology for the 21st century, electronic document rooms to share information across the agency. Also, they looked at ways to harmonize inventory of FDA-related entities around the world. And they started working on what was called the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System, which we now call MedWatch. So that started with that, and also the Sentinel Initiative, which enables the FDA to look ahead and predict what's going to happen, along with what was called the Janus Initiative, which morphed into some of the other work that we're seeing from the agency. So how did they do that? They also recognized that they needed standards in order to implement all these systems. So what they did is they put together the Bioinformatics Board as well as a Data Standards Council that enabled the agency to work with industry experts as well as standards development organizations to leverage some of the standards that we know and love today. So in our next slide, we have, the big focus was around HL7 and CDISC as the standard to get information across the industry, interacting with the Data Council, with global regulatory environments, what at the time was, the international regulatory standards. Now, through ICH, we're seeing a lot of that work being done, and really working with the entire ecosystem to develop standards that could be leveraged across the organization. So what are the benefits of this digital transformation, or e-transformation as we called it back then? So the benefits really are game-changing for the entire industry. The ability to conduct, for example, a label negotiation in real time with FDA staff, and the ability to review documents, whether they're policies or procedures as part of an inspection or a label or information about the product. And one of the silver linings of COVID, if you will, is the fact that we all had to transform, and FDA leveraged FDAs Title VII, Section 706, which gives the agency the statutory authority to request information in preparation or in lieu of an inspection, to do a lot of remote assessments. And they're leveraging that in what we call the review of the future, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail moving forward. So let's fast forward to 2019. So 10 years have passed, and the FDA rolled out what it calls their Technology Modernization Action Plan. So recognizing that you can't just stay at where you were in 2009, you need to continue to evolve from a technology standpoint. And what does that entail? The agency is really looking to implement enterprise-wide modernization. So what this means is that as part of TMAP, the Technology Modernization Action Plan, the agency is looking to move as many of its systems as possible to the cloud and adopting as-a-service models. They're looking to streamline software development capabilities for specific business needs. They are also implementing data stewardship and data management to facilitate data exchange. They're looking at ways to integrate scientific computing into enterprise-wide models, as well as implementing enterprise IT governance and retiring legacy systems and software applications where appropriate, and moving those to modern cloud software as a service models. So the culmination, or at least, or if you will, actually the genesis, it's not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. The next step is the creation of the Office of Digital Transformation. So if we look at our next slide, earlier this year, the FDA rolled out what it's called the Data Modernization Action Plan, or DMAP. And then on September 15th, it announced the creation of the Office of Digital Transformation. And this is really a paradigm shift for the industry and for the agency. So let's look at our next slide and the quote from the acting FDA commissioner. So Dr. Woodcock recognized in that the FDA manages massive amounts of data in order to be able to generate important decisions that support patient outcomes. So the agency created ODT, the Office of Digital Transformation, in order to improve regulatory processes with solid data foundations that are built at every level of the organization. So let's dig a little bit deeper around how transforming industry, how we can transform industry across the entire product lifecycle. And let's look at the fact that Dr. Gottlieb, the 23rd commissioner of the FDA, recognized that some advances around transformation will be made through modern and scientific approaches to how the FDA collects, evaluates, and processes its clinical data as part of the drug development process. But he also recognized that modernization requires changes in the way that the FDA does business. It's not just about the technology, because digital transformation, in our research, the biggest barrier to digital transformation is actually culture, not technology. The technology exists today. So the agency is actually undergoing that transformation by changing the way it interacts with us in industry. And a good example is it's modernizing the review process, but it's also modernizing the way it interacts with us. And one of my colleagues, Sandra Rodriguez, calls GMP great mounds of paper, because the way we've interacted with industry, with FDA has been through a lot of paper, or even electronic paper, PDFs, they're static documents. What's happening is the agency is transitioning to digital evidence. And what does digital evidence mean? Let's go to the next slide and see how the agency defines it. So Dr. Tina Morrison, who was at the time she made the statement, the deputy director of the Division of Applied Mechanics, and led FDA's modeling and simulation initiatives, talked about the fact that simulation and modeling are not made up stuff. There's significant value that with the appropriate level of credibility, digital evidence can reduce the burden on physical testing, in vivo studies, saving both animals and patients. Now, it's worth mentioning that Tina was recently promoted to be Director of Regulatory Science and Innovation across the entire agency, and now is a member of the senior executive staff at FDA. So this is continuing. So how is FDA actually using modeling and simulation internally in order to support this transition from documented evidence to digital evidence? And here are some examples directly from the agency around how they're leveraging modeling and simulation across multiple approaches, whether it's chemical, mechanical, statistical, physics, big data, and risk assessments, in order to improve their processes and patient outcomes. The next step is the transition from our current interaction model, where we're really generating a lot of data in static documents, and transitioning to what the agency calls the review of the future. So what that means is that in the current paradigm, we are basing submissions on documents and data sets It's a very asynchronous process. So we send information to the agency and we're waiting for the reviewer to ask us a question, and then we go back and forth. It's really based on traditional evidence sources, clinical bench animal studies. We're also a sequential and often adversarial process, and it's based on precedent. As a result, it's very inefficient. It can be somewhat opaque and unclear, and it creates a level of mistrust. So the review of the future will enable us, if you click on the animation, it'll enable us to move to a more total product lifecycle based approach, where it's synchronous. We can share information and review information at the same time. We can move to more advanced evidence sources, whether those are digital evidence or real world evidence and data. It becomes more of a collaborative, evidence-based and efficient process that is more transparent and builds trust. So how do we do that? In order to make that happen, we need to modernize the way that data is made available across the entire product lifecycle. And as Dr. Woodcock said, data is foundational to good science. And building on the success of the Technology Modernization Action Plan, the FDA rolled out DMAP, where it's looking at very particular use cases, data practices, and talent in order to improve the way it manages data across the organization. And DMAP is based on 4 primary pillars. One is identification, so building effective solutions using data that requires the ability to identify the right data, because we have a lot of data. Some of it is useful, some of it not so much. So looking at ways to catalog the data and create workflows in order to enable us to get the right information and the right data. The next step is curating that data. So looking at ways to organize and integrate that data that is collected from multiple sources so that it can drive data-based decisions. So curation increases confidence in the use of the data and reduces cycle time without compromising analytic rigor. And some of the key initiatives around curation are characterization of the data on attributes, classification of user data, as well as the development of fit-for-purpose services that match curation with analytic needs using agile and scalable models. The next step is data governance, and this is critical, is understanding how governance or how data is managed across the entire product lifecycle and across the entire data lifecycle, so that it enables the ability to reduce waste and friction when we're making database decisions. The agency is actually looking for ways to leverage modern technologies like AI algorithms in order to support the best outcomes and governance for that data. And then the final pillar is automation. So the ability to automate processes will drive exponential value, because according to Moore's law, we're doubling computing power every 18 months, which means we're doubling the amount of information that we can get. And that data is growing exponentially and is becoming persuasive across both industry and regulatory agencies. And automation will provide the ability to streamline those processes without overwhelming people. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Kevin, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Certara is supporting digital transformation across the industry.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So yeah, let's start back with the first date that Dan mentioned back in 1997, where the FDA did include in its Code of Federal Regulations for Food and Drugs, this Part 11, that governs, it's a governance for electronic records and electronic signatures. So this part applies to records, any record in electronic form that is going to be created or modified, maintained, archived or retrieved, or for that matter, transmitted under any of the records requirements set forth in the agency regulations. So this is now almost a quarter of a century since this has been introduced. And of course, in the beginning, it was a way to make a distinction between electronic and paper records. But as of course now, we all know that the majority, if not all records, tend to be electronic anyway. So this is really what's governing our lives in terms of the storage and the authentication of electronic records that go to the FDA. So if we skip forward, because it does take time for all this to set in, and ultimately the FDA, needs to find ways to leverage that. So if we go forward to 2019, we could see that the FDA updated their guidance, or they put forth a draft for a guidance on population pharmacokinetics. So Dan mentioned that we are now, the FDA is really trying to make better use of modeling and simulation. And of course, population PK is one form of modeling and simulation that's increasingly playing a bigger role in the submissions of drug approvals. So what they're saying, there's a lot of things that went into the draft, but probably the part that caught the most attention was around reporting of results. So the FDA at the very end of the document is talking about that, now the FDA staff would like to be able to identify the source data associated with any data set, as well as the post-processing of any results that went into a population PK analysis. They're saying that the sponsor should ensure that the traceability between the POP-PK model and any output steps involved in the construction of data set should be clear. And this, can be potentially accomplished by providing definition files, reviewer guides, or the codes actually used in data assembly. And finally, that any conclusions made from POP-PK analysis should really actually be reproducible by the agency itself, through having access to the codes and data. So this is really a change to what the sponsors are used to submitting along with a POP-PK analysis. But, if, as Dan mentioned, the FDA would like to move to relying more on modeling and simulation for the replacement of animal studies or the reduction in human studies as well. But we need to make sure that any such work is absolutely rigorous and reproducible. So, this is why the sort of the tightening of the reins on POP-PK. So if we couple that with the 2021 Data Modernization Action Plan that Dan has already gone through, where there were 3 critical elements of success identified, the second element being data practices through identification, curation, governance, and automation. The FDA in this document talks about in order to ensure their ability to have reproducibility, they would like to be able to search and review available metadata, data and metadata, as well as have some kind of workflow process that would allow them to request and approve access to data. So, if we take all these things combined, one of the ways we can see all this going towards auditing digital evidence is in this direction of a virtual audit. So I think that's the next step that we can all anticipate. Certainly during COVID, at Certara we have many vendor assessments where pharma companies audit us for our data security and for our computer system validation practices and so forth. And all of those really converted to virtual. And so, during that period of time, and so these things that are things that can really be done. So, providing sufficient evidence, things to bear in mind here is that Electronic record reconstruction through traditional means, right? Submitting a bunch of files to the FDA is quite a burden for the sponsor to actually extract and assemble those things from their systems and submit them to the FDA. And it can also be, very time consuming for the agency themselves to have to try to reconstruct everything that the sponsor did. And certainly if you're trying to do that on every single submission, that would be quite an onerous task. So ideally, where you would want to see this go is that the sponsor would actually be conducting and storing their analyses from beginning to end within a 21 CFR Part 11 compliant repository, where temporary access to that content could be granted to the agency for the inspection kind of in situ, right? So that this would accomplish, a number of items. One, it would basically replicate the rigor of an on-site audit without the expense of travel, right? So there's access to a lot more information in an on-site audit than an actual submission, but this could actually bring up submission type audit to that sort of level. It would increase compliance and transparency in research, because I think the sponsors themselves would start to be a little bit more careful in research in order to ensure, knowing that the agency there's a high chance that they're going to be looking at this. That always puts people in line a little bit more strictly. It would reduce the sponsor's effort also in preparing the submission. So there's no necessary extra steps. It's just about allowing access to the actual work environment. And it would also make it quite easy for the agency to trace the provenance of these results, right? I mean, you can see within that draft POP-PK guidance, there's a large emphasis on traceability. Where did the data begin? What happened to those data? And where did that actually go in terms of, influencing results and reporting the results, wanting to be able to see that lineage? And that becomes very, very obvious if you can do that audit directly in the system. So Certara does have a system like that, a Part 11 compliant repository called Integral, that could meet this need, because it is a cloud-based application with direct URL access and with highly configurable read-only access controls. So there's all those kinds of things like data and analysis dependencies and versioning of the analysis and files, as well as some utility in there as well for QC review processes that can help to show those traceability connections, as well as just to simply viewing files and making comparisons between files, versions of files directly in the repository. So the technology is there now to support these kind of virtual audits, and we would expect to see, given the DMAP initiative of the FDA, them moving in that direction. So I'll just pass that back to Dan so we can start to talk about data as the foundation of good science.
Yep, absolutely. And I think just building on what you said, the agency implemented these remote assessments during COVID, and they're really here to stay because, to your point, Kevin, if you can achieve the same or similar level of control, or actually higher level of controls often by doing these assessments remotely, and also ensuring data integrity, it just facilitates the process, which leads us to the fact that data is the foundation for good science. If the data is suspect, then any decisions that are made on top of that data are suspect. And Dr. Robert Califf, who was the 22nd commissioner of the FDA and maybe our next commissioner of the FDA, said that by themselves, data are meaningless. Only when we add the critical context about what's being measured and how they will become information, and then they will become information. And that information can then be analyzed and combined to yield evidence, which in turn can be used to guide decision making. And the example that I always like to use for this point is the story about Goldilocks. So she goes into the bear house and finds a bowl of porridge. And let's say the porridge is 160 degrees. If I were to ask you, is that too hot, too cold, or just right? The answer depends on the metadata, right? Because I only told you it's 160 degrees. I didn't tell you the unit of measure. If I tell you that it's 160 degrees Kelvin, it's going to be way too cold. If it's actually going to be frozen. If I tell you it's 160 degrees Celsius, it's going to be too hot. But if I tell you it's 160 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be just right. So this is where it's so important to understand not just the data, but the metadata and the context. Being able to have data integrity across the entire study so that it can be replicated and it can be validated becomes critically important. So with that in mind, Kevin, can you tell us your perspective on the value of standards and how we can turn and provide context that enables us to turn this data into actionable insights?
Sure. So, you know, one of the things that's been around now already for basically 5 years is CDISC as a requirement for studies that started, clinical trials that started after December 2016. I think it was December 17th, 2016. So CDISC, and you know, a bit of background so we all are on the same page. It's CDISC is a nonprofit organization with a broad spectrum of industry participants, and they have this mission to increase the impact of clinical research through establishing and promoting the use of data standards for clinical data collection, analysis, and transmission. And you know, these standards have been adopted by the FDA for any new drug application, investigational new drug application, abbreviated new drug application, and even for some of the biologic license application filings. So, like I said, this has been going on for 5 years, and in fact, even longer. So, you know, CDISC was on the horizon for many years prior to that. And so, you know, it's not uncommon for a lot of sponsors by this point to already have sort of a decade's worth of drug development data, you know, both perhaps preclinical and clinical CDISC formatted XPT files. But, you know, and they make these files, and these are just the, you know, the clinical trial data in electronic format that they're now submitting alongside ECTD. And this is, they do it because, you know, the FDA and as well as the PMDA now ask them to do that. But is there, you know, the question is, have they actually been getting any other, you know, return on investment other than compliance with the FDA's request? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is no, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, because I think the value in having all of your clinical trial data in a standardized format, and, you know, that's the same format across the industry, is that it does lend itself for data mining and data exploration. So that's really the untapped value of CDISC, of having the data in this single format, because now we're in a position to aggregate it and mine it for insight. So ideally, the data repository in which sponsors are storing their CDISC domains would have some functionality to facilitate this workflow. So number one, having the ability to validate the domains for CDISC compliance, having the ability to extract the content from those SAS transport files and to take that content to put it into relational tables, providing a data mining kind of utility that would allow them to query the database that's now been created based on the CDISC data, and then also having that ability to do the aggregation. You know, aggregation in and of itself is like creating a data set, a new data set from on the basis of other data sets, right? So these are analysis data sets that can be used for any purpose, but also then being able to visualize those aggregated data sets through a visualization functionality. So that's what we could imagine really the way the system should work, or what should be commercially available. And so Certara is in the process of moving toward that. So I mentioned before, we have this integral repository, which is a Part 11 compliant repository, and we have configured it to actually do this kind of extraction of CDIS data from those XPT files. And so the next steps for us are to enhance it further. Number one, to integrate it with our now gold standard Pinnacle 21 data standards validation engine that we just completed the purchase of earlier this month. And then also we have a proprietary D360 data mining technology that we can layer on top of that to do those aggregations, queries, and visualizations. So this is something that we're very interested in doing to really capitalize on the value that CDIS standardization has introduced. So, through this centralization and automation, we are endeavoring to move data standardization upstream in the drug development lifecycle in order to improve data accessibility and transparency. So I'll pass it back to Dan now at this point. You can tell us a little bit more about using technology to get value from your data.
Thanks, Kevin. So one of the technologies that we're all hearing about today is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the agency recognized the value of AI and machine learning and the potential to fundamentally transform the delivery of healthcare. Dr. Gottlieb talked about the fact that we can expect to see earlier disease detection, more accurate diagnosis, more targeted therapies, and significant improvements in personalization of medicines based on the use of AI. And in fact, the agency has already released what it calls the Good Machine Learning Practices, or GMLP. And this provides a framework for the use of AI and machine learning as it relates to medical products. The primary uses right now are around software as a medical device. So when you're leveraging software and AI as a medical device to identify, treat, or address a particular disease. But this framework is being leveraged across the industry, because if FDA is stating how its current thinking around the use of AI and machine learning, this really provides a tremendous opportunity for us to leverage that as well. So what's next for AI in FDA's realm? So Dr. Amy Abernathy, who was the previous Chief Information Officer at FDA, talked about the fact that FDA is sitting on a treasure trove of data. And as Kevin mentioned, it's not just the FDA, but each one of the sponsors. And the aggregation of all that data can really provide significant value to improve patient outcomes. So the agency intends to deploy artificial intelligence to increase the effectiveness of reviewers and field investigators while ensuring analytical rigor and avoiding bias. They're intending to use AI to support adverse events detection earlier on, to looking at signals earlier on across different data sets and post-market data. They're planning to use machine learning in order to study the effects of synthesized data sets for training and testing in both pre-market testing as well as across the entire product lifecycle. And they will use natural language processing and human workflows to code adverse events to the International Conference of Harmonization Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activity, so MEDRA standards. Another use for AI is around being able to employ it to inform the agency's ANDA workload and prioritize research by predicting time to submission and referencing new chemical entities. So the agency is really intending to take advantage of this new technology in order to streamline processes, get better understanding and earlier understanding of data sets and what it means, and also to leverage real-world evidence and post-market data in order to identify signals earlier within the process. So Kevin, I'll turn it back to you for you to share your perspective on ways on which we can use technologies like AI and others to get more value out of our data.
Sure. So let's return to, we were talking about submissions and the electronic component, the data component, as well as the ECTD. And I want to just spend a little bit of time on that electronic common technical document. And that's because even with the advent of standardized data required as part of these submissions, the ECTD, human readable document continues to play a critical role in describing study conduct and outcomes. That's not only for the agency, but we have to remember that all of these documents are eventually anonymized so that the public can have access to this information as well. And this is more easily consumed in a human readable format than just only having the data. So it is imperative with, now that we have both the CDISC data as well as the ECTD, that these things are absolutely the same or congruent, right? So the description of study results, interpretation that follows in the ECTD really needs to be accurately and inextricably based on those vetted collected data. And this does result in ensuring that rather elaborate and expensive quality control systems. And this is all very much a human endeavor. So medical writing is a human intensive, and anywhere where there's a lot of human intensity, there's also the possibility of errors being introduced. Mm-hmm. So it consumes a great deal of time, and it tends to be happening at very critical junctures in the drug life cycle, right? I mean, at the point that we're reporting the outcomes of trials, these are probably, we're in a situation where we have a great deal of confidence that this is something that we can get approved because we're actually, doing the submission. So the clock is really ticking. Mm-hmm. Because sponsors would like to get their, drugs to the patients as quickly as possible so that, they can realize the benefit that they promise. So any technology solution that would ensure a high fidelity between the electronic data, the CDISC data, with the ECTD data representations, and could help to automate that lengthy process of medical writing would, conceivably provide a significant acceleration to this whole process of bringing medicines to market. So, this kind of brings to mind a sort of another underutilized value proposition of having all that clinical trial data being converted in electronic form first place in that universal data model, because it would be possible to now extract those data from it and have those represented in natural language text. Mm-hmm. So ideally, sponsors should be able to develop some sort of reporting templates, and a software would allow them to sort of drag and drop fields of CDISC data sets to auto-populate both the in-text tables associated with ECTD, but also the written text of the clinical study reports. And so machine learning has proven very effective, and there's many case studies at that, for that, at summarizing text, which could be used for interpretation purposes of the data when paired with human curation for improvement over time, right? That's therein lies the learning component. Mm-hmm. And if this is done repeatedly with multiple users, eventually this leads to insights that could actually be missed by individual writers. So, this getting back to Dan's point about gaining additional insights, this is actually a way to improve individual performance in the authoring of these documents. So Certara does have a product which it released very recently called Synchrogenics Writer. And the purpose of this product is to automate components of the ECTD, right? So in the beginning, we're beginning with what are called patient narratives, but the idea is to expand this into auto writing much of what is involved in a drug submission. So right now we're working with a large pharma company in a customized project to help automate the authoring of the safety section of the CSR, for example. And again, we just hope to build upon that further. So combining this investment in artificial intelligence and utilizing the expertise that we have at Certara, both in medical writing and data standards, we hope to produce really significant gains in a space that's really, to this day, heavily reliant on consumer office software that many of us use every day. But there isn't this kind of platform that allows you to bring to bear the weight of technology that we have on a process that's highly manual today. So that's what we're hoping to do, to make better use of artificial intelligence and the actual reporting of data and ensuring the fidelity between those electronic data and the actual human readable documents.
Okay.
So yeah. Great. So with that, Danny, I'll pass that back to you for Q&A.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Daniel, as well for the presentation for today for the audience. Before we get into the Q&A session, just as a reminder to the audience, if you would like to ask Daniel or Kevin any questions, you can ask those questions through the question tab on the GoToWebinar toolbar that should be at the right of your screen. So without further ado, we have gotten a few questions in. So I will kick this first one off to you, Kevin. So the first question is, a population PK analyses can be incredibly complicated and are often performed with software that were not validated. So the question is, how is the FDA reviewing pop PK submissions without the information being requested in the draft guidance?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So maybe the first thing to note is that I'm not an FDA reviewer, nor have I ever been. So it's a bit of a tough question, but clearly they're asking for this information because they feel that they're not able to sort of perform their duties, if you like, if I could say, like they're not able to apply the rigor to the audit of pop PK that they feel they should be, which is why they're proposing this additional ask. Now, I happen to know through some connections in the industry, some groups that have actually been submitting this kind of information anyway, even prior to this 2019 update. They told me that they were already submitting that kind of thing, but that does not seem to be, a common practice in the industry. So I think honestly, the FDA will have struggled to perform the sort of kind of rigor in an audit that they may be used to doing in a field like biostatistics, where they had a lot more information available to them to do this kind of audit. Whereas I suppose in pop PK they were feeling that they were a little bit scant on what was available. So I think it's a move in the right direction, and it's really a signal that they're going to be getting more serious about this electronic records and traceability, especially when it's these things start to play a more important role within the approval process, modeling and simulation. I think the rigor and expectations is only going to increase.
Great, thank you for that, Kevin. And Dan, we got a question I'll throw to you first. So the question is, what is going to be the impact of digital transformation on our industry? And the follow-up question being is it going to be in the United States specifically or all around the world?
So the impact of digital transformation is going to be extremely disruptive, but it's what we call positive disruption. it's really going to enable us to get better, more personalized products to market sooner that improve patient outcomes. So digital transformation will apply across the entire product lifecycle. So from early stage R&D through submissions, and then manufacturing and post-market surveillance, we're going to need to transform the way that we do business as an industry. I think what's also important to mention is that the agency, historically, industry had come to the agency or to regulators and regulatory bodies around the world and said, hey, we need you to come up with a standard for electronic records and electronic signatures as that example. And FDA then put something together. What we're seeing now is that regulators around the world are taking the initiative. So to talk specifically about FDA, for example, if you look at the people that are leading the agency, Vid Desai came from our industry before joining FDA. So he understands what the industry pain points are, and that is extremely important. Ram Ayer, who is the chief data officer at FDA, also came out of industry. So there's a very deep understanding of the challenges that industry faces, and the FDA is really getting in front of it. The second part to that question is around whether or not it's just the FDA. And the answer is no. There's a lot of harmonization that's going on through ICH, and there's a lot of collaboration that are happening through regulatory bodies around the world. And just to use an example, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, already has a task force on digital business transformation. So this is something that we're going to continue to see moving forward throughout the world and throughout our industry, because our industry is global. And it makes it a lot easier for us when we have standards and we have processes that are consistent throughout regulatory bodies around the world.
Great, thank you for that, Dan. And then a question for you, Kevin. So it's around what you were talking about with CDISC. So the question is, you spoke about using CDISC data as the basis for reviewing clinical trial outcomes. The problem is that clinical trial data is only converted to CDISC format as a final step before submission. Wouldn't data exploration be more useful before conversion to CDISC so that trial outcomes could be reviewed in real time?
Yeah, that's a very fair comment. So, and it's true, because it does tend to be the last thing that people do is convert all their data over to the electronic format for submission. But I think what we're trying to do at Certara is that we're trying to find ways to move the standardization of data upstream. So this happens much sooner. So rather than being an afterthought and this kind of burdensome thing that nobody knows why we're doing it, converting the data to CDISC just because the agency told us to, there's a lot of value, as I described in a few different ways here already, in having that standardized format. So I think it's worthwhile encouraging, just encouraging sponsors to do it sooner so we can leverage that. But we're also interested in providing solutions. So Pinnacle 21, the new member of our family, they're very heavily engaged in the promotion of standards and providing technology solutions to help you get those data into that standard more in an earlier point in time, so that you can begin to realize the benefits of standardization, in this sort of real time type of scenario that the person is asking the question around. So if we can manage to move the standardization sooner into the process, then I think that's where we're really going to reap the benefits of having done that.
And if I can comment on that as well, Danny, one of the things that has been endemic within our industry is the fact that we have been very reactive to what do the regulators want. So what's the checklist that we need to fill in order to meet the regulatory requirements? And in our conversations with FDA officials, they've recognized that that's been some of the unintended consequences of the way that the regulators have been regulating industry, is they turned us into box checkers. So this particular example is very important because we shouldn't be just doing something because, or converting the data to this, CDIS, for example, just because the regulators asked us to. We need to look at what's the value that we can get, to build on Kevin's point, and how can we leverage that which regulators are asking us for a reason. Let's understand what's the rationale for asking for that information, rather than saying, I'm going to check the box and say, here you go, it's in CDIS format now, I'm done with it. So we really need to change the culture, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, to focus on quality and outcomes rather than just focusing on meeting regulatory requirements. And that is a difficult thing to do because change is hard, or change is easy as long as I'm asking you to change. Change is hard if you're asking me to change. So I think it's extremely important that we change the culture.
Great, thank you for that insight, Dan. And I'm gonna throw another one of these questions to you, Kevin. It was along the slide you covered around the medical writing. So it's more of just a general question on how long does the medical writing process take for a clinical trial?
Okay, yeah, sort of to contextualize, you know, the opportunity in terms of, you know, how much time could we save if we did automate the medical writing process. So so we do have a large medical writing service that we have here at Certara, and you know, for a drug submission, I guess that's a little bit of a complicated question because it, I guess, depends how complicated it is and how many documents are included. But if I maybe focus in on just a CSR, so a clinical study report, which is obviously only a component of a submission, right? So a submission for a new drug application, for example, consists of many of those and many other documents. But just one CSR, I think the data that we have internally is that it's going to take anywhere between 200 and 600 hours to author a CSR, you know, man hours. So, you know, just with this one component of a submission, there is, you know, through automation, and, you know, it's the actual authoring, but then also the implications on quality control that are embedded within a highly a process with high fidelity. I think there's really significant gains in human intervention in both the writing and the actual quality control. So I think what we're looking at is something like 200 to 600 hours for a CSR.
Okay. Thank you for that, Kevin. We have 1 more minute left in the presentation, so I'm just going to do one final question to be respectful of everyone's times. But for anyone that does need to jump, I do just want to give a heads up that we do have a 4-question post survey, or post-webinar evaluation survey that we'd love your feedback on. So without further ado, the final question, and this came in to you, Dan. So the question is, could Mr. Matlis elaborate when he mentioned that simulations are digital evidence with the appropriate level of credibility? The question being, what exactly is an appropriate level of credibility?
So yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, Tina led a team at a cross-functional team at ASME that developed the VNV 4.0, the Validation and Verification 4.0, to provide a framework for what modeling and simulation is ready for regulatory submissions. To date, there actually have been over 200 submissions that leverage modeling and simulation in order to support that regulatory approval or review. So the standard is already out there. It's a question of going out there and looking and finding it. Tina and her team have also authored a number of peer-reviewed articles on how the agency is using modeling and simulation, and some of the work that is being done across the board to leverage modeling and simulation in regulatory submissions, but more importantly, to streamline the product development lifecycle.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Dan. And that will conclude our presentation for today.